I had always considered myself an ordinary guy. My name is Mark, and for the better part of the last decade I've worked as a systems analyst at a mid-sized tech company in the city. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills and keeps me mentally stimulated. My wife, Rebecca, or Becky as I affectionately call her, is a freelance graphic designer. She's been doing quite well, especially over the last couple of years, her client list growing almost as fast as her reputation. We met 12 years ago at a college party. She was the kind of woman who could light up any room with a laugh that was infectious and a wit that could cut you to pieces if you weren't on your toes. I was captivated from the first moment I saw her. We dated through the rest of college, moved in together a few months after graduation, and got married 2 years later. Ours was a relationship that had always seemed solid. At least, that's what I'd thought. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but then, whose is? We had our ups and downs like anyone else. We argued about the usual things, money, chores, and the occasional petty grievances. But there was love there, I was sure of it, at least until a few months ago when everything started to feel off. Rebecca had always been independent, but lately her independence felt more like distance. She had started spending more time out of the house, supposedly meeting clients, networking at events, and attending workshops. I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. At least I tried to. But there were signs, small at first, that something wasn't right. She had started coming home later and later, her excuses growing flimsier each time. I remember the first time I felt that gnawing feeling in my gut, 2 months ago, when she had come home smelling like a man's cologne. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off with a laugh, saying she had accidentally spilled perfume on herself at a client's office. It didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. I told myself I was being paranoid. Then there were the late-night text messages. She claimed they were from clients in different time zones, but her phone would always be angled away from me, her body language tense. I remember lying in bed beside her, her face illuminated by the screen's glow, her fingers typing rapidly, followed by the sound of her quiet laughter. I asked who she was talking to, and she'd always say it was just work stuff. The more I observed, the more I noticed. The hastily closed laptop when I entered the room, the phone calls she took in, whispered tones behind closed doors. My mind began to wander down dark alleys, imagining the worst. I started to wonder if there was someone else, some other man who had captured her attention. But I still clung to hope. I convinced myself that every marriage goes through phases, that we were simply in a rut. I made an effort to be more attentive, to plan more dates, to rekindle what we once had. But it felt like I was the only one trying. Becky seemed distracted, distant. Her smiles became rarer, her touch colder. Still, I pushed on, unwilling to confront the possibility that something more sinister was at play. Then one night, it all changed. The final straw was when she came home wearing a red dress I'd never seen before. She looked stunning, her hair tousled and cheeks flushed. I complimented her, but instead of the usual playful banter or appreciative kiss, she just gave me a half-hearted smile and said she was tired. No explanation of where she'd been or who she'd been with. And that was when the doubts crystallized into a plan that would either confirm my darkest suspicions or make me feel like a fool. The idea of installing a hidden camera had been born from desperation. I needed to know, needed to see for myself. I knew it was wrong, invasive, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. I ordered a tiny, inconspicuous camera online, one that I could attach to my shirt. A device small enough to go unnoticed, but sharp enough to capture everything I needed to see. I decided to go straight to the source. I was going to find this lover, if he existed at all. But I had no idea just how twisted things were about to get. The day I decided to confront her lover, I felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement coursing through my veins. I had spent the previous week meticulously planning my approach, poring over every detail in my head like I was preparing for a high-stakes operation. And in a way, I was. I was about to step into a world I had only glimpsed from the shadows, a world where my wife existed with another man. I had done my homework. I started by trailing Becky a few nights, always keeping a safe distance. I was careful, methodical, noting down each place she visited, the time she arrived, the time she left. I felt like a character in some noir film, a detective in a case he never wanted to solve. Then, last Tuesday, I hit pay dirt. She had told me she was going to a client meeting, but I decided to follow her anyway. I watched as she pulled into a nondescript apartment building on the other side of town. It was one of those old brick buildings with peeling paint and a dingy, unlit stairwell that seemed to lead nowhere. She got out of the car, looked around, her eyes darting nervously, as if she sensed she was being watched, and then walked inside. I waited for an hour, maybe more, my palms slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel. When she finally emerged, her hair was a mess, her blouse half tucked, her lipstick smudged. My heart sank. She looked around again, this time with a smile on her face, one I hadn't seen in months. I knew then that I wasn't imagining things. She was seeing someone, and that someone lived in this building. I wanted to storm inside, to confront them both, right there. But I knew I had to play this smart. I needed more proof, more than just a suspicion and a gut feeling. That's when I decided to set the trap. I took a deep breath and rang a few doorbells, pretending to be lost, delivering a package, or whatever excuse came to mind. I wasn't looking for just any door. I needed the right door. Finally, a woman on the third floor, tired of my questioning, pointed me to an apartment at the end of the hall, number 3C. She told me a man named Tony lived there. I thanked her, a forced smile on my face, and walked away, my mind racing with possibilities. Tony. I had a name. I had an address. Now I just needed a plan. The next morning, I left for work as usual, but drove back home an hour later. I called in sick, my voice shaky, but convincing enough. Then, I spent the next few hours gathering what I needed: the hidden camera, a portable charger, and some excuse notes in case I was questioned. I felt a strange sense of detachment, like I was watching myself from a distance, orchestrating a plan I had no control over. By noon, I was ready. I attached the hidden camera to my shirt, careful to position it just right. The device was small, hidden behind a button, the lens no bigger than a pinhole. I tested it a few times in front of a mirror, checking the angle, making sure it wasn't visible. This was it. Today, I was going to meet Tony. I drove across town, my hands gripping the wheel tighter with each mile. I parked a few blocks away from the building and walked the rest of the distance, my heart pounding like a drum. I knew I was about to cross a line, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. I climbed the steps to the third floor, feeling the weight of my decision with each step. Finally, I stood in front of the door to apartment 3C. I could hear muffled voices inside, laughter. I took a deep breath and knocked. The door swung open, and there he was, a tall, rugged man with a cocky grin plastered across his face. He looked like someone who had stepped straight out of a magazine, his hair perfectly styled, his shirt clinging to his muscular frame. He looked at me, confused at first, but then his face lit up with a wide, amused smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice dripping with arrogance. For a moment, I felt a wave of panic. What was I doing here? Was I really about to confront him? I swallowed hard, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I'm Mark," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Rebecca's husband." And that was when he laughed, a deep, mocking laugh that sent a shiver down my spine. "Oh," he chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "Another cuckold husband came to visit." He looked back over his shoulder, and a woman appeared behind him. She was wrapped in a towel, her hair wet, her eyes wide with surprise. It took me a moment to register who she was, but then I saw the familiar curve of her lips, the small scar above her left eyebrow. It was Becky. Tony turned back to me, his grin growing wider. "Don't worry," he said, his voice loud enough for Becky to hear. "Your wife is just my latest toy. I'll use it a little more, and then I'll throw it aside, and it will be yours again." I felt my blood turn to ice, my hands balling into fists. He didn't see it coming. My revenge would be quick and merciless. I stood there frozen, the world narrowing to the size of a pinhole through the hidden camera on my shirt. Tony's laughter still echoed in my ears, and Becky was just standing there, wrapped in that damn towel, her hair dripping wet, eyes wide, caught between shock and something else. Was it amusement? Or maybe she just didn't care. Either way, the sight of her, fresh from the shower in another man's apartment, cut through me like a knife. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but all I could do was stare, my throat tight, my hands trembling. Tony seemed to relish in my discomfort. He was enjoying this, savoring every second of my humiliation. His words, dripping with contempt, still hung in the air. "Your wife is just my latest toy." I couldn't breathe. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating in a sea of betrayal. My mind was spinning, racing through every moment, every doubt, every suspicion. And now, here it was, laid bare in front of me, the truth I had been so afraid to see. Becky finally moved, stepping forward, her face flushed, but not with shame. No, there was something else there. Defiance. "Mark," she began, her voice too calm, too composed for the situation. I didn't expect you to come here." I almost laughed. "Didn't expect me?" I repeated, my voice louder than I intended. "What the hell is going on, Becky? Who is this asshole?" I gestured towards Tony, who was still smirking, arms crossed, enjoying the show. Tony cut in before she could respond. "Oh, come on, Mark. Don't make this harder than it has to be. She's been with me for months. Did you really think all those late-night meetings and client visits were real? Man, you are dense." I felt a surge of anger, a hot wave that washed over me. "Shut up," I growled, stepping closer to him. "This is between me and my wife." He just chuckled again, looking over his shoulder at Becky. "Your wife?" he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "She hasn't been yours in a long time, buddy." Becky glanced at him, then back at me. She didn't say a word. Her silence was louder than anything she could have spoken. I could see it in her eyes, a mixture of guilt maybe, but also something like relief. Relief that it was finally out in the open, that she no longer had to hide. "Why, Becky?" I finally asked, my voice breaking. "Why him? Why this?" She sighed, looking down for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts, and then she met my gaze. "I don't know, Mark," she said quietly. "I needed something different. Something more. It just happened." "Something more?" I spat back. "More than what? More than me? More than our marriage?" She flinched at that, her face tightening. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered, as if that made any of this easier to understand. Tony stepped back, folding his arms again, clearly enjoying the unraveling of our marriage right in front of him. "Look," he said, "if you two need to talk, I'll give you some privacy." His grin made it clear he found the entire situation hilarious. "No," I said firmly, turning my gaze back to him. "I want to hear it from you, Becky. How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to Tony as if seeking his permission to speak. That made my blood boil even more. "A few months," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It started last summer, at that gallery opening, remember? Tony was there with some friends. We talked. One thing led to another. One thing led to another." The words were a knife twisting in my gut. And all those nights you were working late? All those weekends with friends? She nodded, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. I'm sorry, Mark. I never wanted to hurt you. I let out a bitter laugh. Well, congratulations, Becky. Mission failed. Tony, sensing the shift in the air, stepped back slightly, but his grin remained. Look, man, he said. She's a grown woman. She made her choice. It's not my fault she got bored with you. And that's when something in me snapped. I lunged forward, my fist connecting with his jaw before I even realized what I was doing. The impact sent a shock up my arm, and I watched as Tony stumbled back, surprised more than hurt. Becky screamed, rushing forward to pull me away, but I shrugged her off, my anger a living thing, roaring to be unleashed. Tony recovered quickly, wiping the corner of his mouth with the back of his hand, his smile gone now, replaced by a dark, angry glare. Big mistake, he muttered, and he swung back, his fist catching me across the face. Pain exploded in my cheek, but I didn't care. I felt nothing but rage, pure and consuming. I tackled him to the ground, and we grappled, fists flying, Becky shouting for us to stop. I could hear her crying, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. This was my revenge, my justice. My wife's betrayal was now laid bare, and I would make sure Tony paid for every second of it. Tony and I were locked in a brutal struggle, grappling on the floor of his dingy apartment like two rabid dogs fighting over a piece of meat. His fist connected with my ribs, sending a sharp pain shooting through my side, but I ignored it, driven by something far more potent than pain: anger. Pure, unfiltered rage coursed through my veins, and I wanted nothing more than to see the smug look wiped off his face for good. We rolled across the floor, knocking over a lamp, shoving furniture aside as we fought for dominance. I could hear Becky screaming somewhere above us, her voice hysterical, pleading for us to stop, but her words meant nothing to me now. I wanted blood. I wanted to make Tony feel every ounce of the pain that was tearing through my chest, tearing through my life. Tony managed to get a knee up, driving it into my stomach, knocking the wind out of me for a second. He used that moment to shove me off, scrambling to his feet, his face twisted with anger and maybe a little fear. "You're crazy!" he shouted, wiping blood from his split lip. I got up, breathing hard, wiping the blood from my own mouth. "You have no idea," I spat back. "You ruined my life. You think you can just laugh at me and walk away?" He looked like he was going to come at me again, but then Becky stepped between us, her hands out, trying to keep us apart. "Stop it, both of you, just stop!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't solving anything!" I was breathing hard, adrenaline still pumping, my hands still clenched into fists. Becky turned to me, her eyes wide, her face flushed. "Mark, please," she begged. Just go home. Let's talk about this, calmly." "Talk?" I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Talk about what, Becky? How you've been screwing this guy behind my back? How you've been lying to me for months?" She flinched, tears still streaming, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. I never wanted this to happen." I shook my head, a cold, numb feeling settling over me. "No," I said. "You wanted this. You chose this." Tony, still standing behind her, sneered. "She chose what made her happy, man. Deal with it." I felt a surge of anger again, but I forced myself to stay still. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of another fight. I looked at Becky, trying to find any trace of the woman I had married, the woman I had loved, but all I saw was a stranger. "Why him, Becky?" I asked quietly, my voice barely a whisper. "Why this piece of shit?" She hesitated, glancing back at Tony before meeting my eyes again. I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It wasn't about him, Mark. It was about me. I felt trapped. I needed something different, Something exciting. Exciting? I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. So you threw away our marriage for some cheap thrill? She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said softly. I didn't mean to hurt you. I laughed again, a hollow sound that echoed in the room. Well, you failed at that, Becky. You failed miserably. Tony stepped forward again, but Becky put a hand on his chest, stopping him. Don't, she said sharply, turning back to me. Mark, please. Let's just go home and talk. But I shook my head. There's nothing to talk about, I said, feeling the numbness spread through my body. Not anymore. I turned on my heel, heading for the door, feeling a cold, hard knot settle in my chest. I could hear Becky calling after me, her voice desperate, pleading, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I stepped out into the hallway, my mind spinning, my body aching from the fight. I felt like I was in a daze, like I was moving through some twisted nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I had come here for answers, and I had gotten them. I just hadn't realized how much they would hurt. I made my way down the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. I pushed through the front door of the building and out into the cold, biting air. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from Becky. I'm sorry, Mark. Please come home. Let's fix this. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with tears. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and a deep, deep sadness. I knew that things would never be the same. I knew that something had been shattered, something that could never be put back together. But a part of me still wanted to believe her. A part of me still wanted to hope that somehow, some way, we could get through this. I put the phone back in my pocket and started walking, unsure of where I was going, unsure of what to do next. I knew one thing, though. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I walked for hours. The cold air stung my face, but I didn't care. I just kept moving, my feet carrying me through the city streets, past the bright lights of storefronts and the murmur of crowds. I had no destination, no plan. I was running on fumes, my body aching, my mind a jumbled mess of anger, hurt, and confusion. The hidden camera was still attached to my shirt, the tiny lens blinking occasionally as it recorded my every move. I had forgotten about it in the chaos of the fight, but now, as I reached into my pocket for my phone, I felt the small bump under my shirt and remembered. I pulled out my phone, and with a few quick taps, I stopped the recording and saved the footage. A part of me knew that I might need it later, that this was far from over. I found myself at a park, one of those small, quiet places tucked away in a corner of the city. The trees were bare, their branches swaying in the wind, and the playground was empty, the swings creaking softly in the breeze. I sat down on a bench, my breath fogging in the cold air, my heart still pounding from everything that had happened. I tried to collect my thoughts, to piece together some semblance of a plan, but all I could think about was Becky's face, her eyes when she admitted everything. The way she had looked at Tony, the way she had stood there between us, as if deciding which one of us mattered more. A deep, gnawing pain settled in my chest, a pain I had never felt before. I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside, like my heart was being ripped out, piece by piece. How had it come to this? How had my marriage, my life, ended up here, on this cold, lonely bench in the middle of a park? I thought about the message Becky had sent, asking me to come home, to talk. The rational part of my brain knew that I should just walk away, that I should cut my losses and leave her to the life she had chosen. But another part of me, a weaker part, still clung to the hope that maybe, somehow, we could fix this. That maybe this was all just a terrible mistake, a bad dream that I could wake up from. I sat there, staring at my phone, my thumb hovering over her name in my contacts. Should I call her? Should I hear her out, give her a chance to explain? Or should I just disappear, let her deal with the consequences of her choices? As I sat there, lost in thought, my phone buzzed again. I looked down and saw another message from Becky. Mark, I'm so sorry. I'm at home. Please, just come back. We can fix this. I read the message twice, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions. My thumb hovered over the call button, but then I hesitated. Did I really want to talk to her? Did I really want to hear more lies, more excuses? But then I thought about the years we had spent together, the memories we had shared, the love we had once had. I thought about the way she used to look at me, the way her laughter had filled our home, the way her touch had made me feel alive. I thought about all the good times, the times before everything had gone wrong. And so, against my better judgment, I pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then I heard her voice on the other end, soft and hesitant. Mark? I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I got your message, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't know, Becky. I don't know if I can just come back. I know, she said quickly, her voice trembling. I know I've hurt you, Mark. I know I've ruined everything. But please, just let me explain. Let me try to make things right. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her words, the desperation in her voice. Explain what, Becky? I asked quietly. Explain how you decided to sleep with another man, how you lied to me for months. She was silent for a moment, and I could hear her breathing, quick and uneven. I know I don't deserve it, she said finally. But please, Mark, please come home. I need to see you. I need to talk to you, face to face. I hesitated, my mind a whirl of confusion. Part of me wanted to hang up, to turn around and never look back. But another part of me, a part I didn't fully understand, wanted to hear her out, to give her one last chance. Fine, I said finally, my voice low. I'll come home. But this better be good, Becky, because I'm not sure I have much left to give. I understand, she whispered. Thank you, Mark. Thank you. I ended the call and sat there for a few more minutes, trying to steady my nerves, trying to brace myself for whatever was coming next. I knew that going back meant opening myself up to more pain, more betrayal. But I also knew that I needed answers, needed closure, needed to understand why. I stood up, my breath visible in the cold night air, and started walking back toward my car. The drive home felt like an eternity, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I saw the lights on in the house, the shadows moving inside. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and got out of the car. I walked up to the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and reached for the handle. I paused for a moment, my hand trembling, and then pushed it open, stepping inside. Becky was waiting for me in the living room, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of fear and hope. Mark, she said softly, her voice breaking. Thank you for coming back. I nodded, closing the door behind me. This is your chance, Becky, I said quietly. Make it count. Becky stood in front of me, wringing her hands, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for the right words, the magic phrase that could somehow make all of this less real, less painful. Her shoulders were slumped, and she looked smaller, more fragile than I had ever seen her. But I wasn't going to let that sway me, not this time. I crossed my arms and waited. The silence between us was thick, suffocating. I could feel the tension in the air, a tight, almost palpable thread pulling us both taut. Mark, she started, her voice trembling. I know I've hurt you. I know I've done something terrible, but I need you to know, it wasn't about you. It was never about you. I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the walls. Really, Becky? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a hell of a lot like it was about me. She flinched, tears pooling in her eyes. I know it seems that way, but I swear, Mark, I never meant to hurt you. I felt lost. I felt like we were stuck, like I was stuck, and I didn't know how to fix it. Fix it? I repeated, my voice rising. And screwing some guy was your idea of fixing it? She shook her head, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. No, I felt like I needed something. I felt like I was disappearing. Like I wasn't myself anymore. And Tony, he made me feel alive again. He made me feel seen. I felt my stomach churn, a wave of nausea rolling over me. Seen? I snapped. I've been right here, Becky. I've always been here. Did you really think you needed another man to make you feel alive? She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I don't expect you to understand, she murmured. I don't even know if I understand, but I needed something different. I needed to feel like I still mattered. I shook my head, anger bubbling up inside me again. And I didn't make you feel that way? Her silence was the only answer I needed. I felt a cold, hollow ache settle in my chest, a realization that cut deeper than anything else had. So, you just decided to throw everything away? I asked quietly. Our marriage, our life, for some cheap thrill? She looked up, her eyes pleading. It wasn't like that, Mark. I never stopped loving you. I swear I didn't. I made a mistake. A huge, stupid mistake. But I love you, and I don't want to lose you. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to keep my voice from shaking. How do I know that, Becky? How do I know you're not just saying that because you got caught? She took a step closer, her hands reaching out to touch me, but I stepped back. I'm not just saying it, she insisted, her voice desperate. I mean it. I want to make things right. I want to fix this if you'll let me. I stared at her, trying to see through her words, trying to find some hint of sincerity, some sign that she meant it. But all I could see was the image of her in that apartment, standing next to Tony, a towel wrapped around her body, her hair still wet from his shower. How, Becky? I asked finally, my voice raw. How do you expect to fix this? She swallowed hard, her face tightening. We can go to therapy, she suggested, her voice hopeful. We can start over. We can try to find a way back to each other. Therapy? I scoffed. You think sitting in a room with a stranger is going to make this better? I don't know, she admitted, her voice small. I don't know what will make this better, but I'm willing to try if you are. I felt a flicker of doubt, a moment of weakness. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, to cling to the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could get through this. But another part of me, the part that had watched her with Tony, that had heard her excuses, her lies, knew that trust was shattered, and it wasn't something that could be easily rebuilt. I don't know if I can, Becky, I said quietly. I don't know if I can forgive you for this. She started to cry then, tears streaming down her face. Please, Mark, she whispered. Please, just give me a chance. Give us a chance. I stood there, feeling torn in two, my heart aching, my mind racing. I knew that whatever I decided, nothing would ever be the same again. I could walk away now, close the door on this chapter of my life, or I could stay, try to find a way back to something that resembled the life we once had. But could I ever really trust her again? Could I ever look at her without seeing Tony, without seeing the betrayal in her eyes? Becky, I began, my voice heavy. I need time. I need time to think, to figure out what I want, if I can do this. She nodded, wiping her tears. Take all the time you need, she said softly. I'll be here, waiting, hoping. that you'll come back to me." I turned away, my heart feeling like it was being ripped from my chest, and walked towards the door. I paused, my hand on the handle, and looked back at her one last time. "I'm not promising anything," I said, "but I'll think about it." And with that, I stepped out into the cold night air, the door closing softly behind me, leaving Becky standing alone in the shadows of our once happy home. I didn't go back home that night. I couldn't. Instead, I drove around for hours, trying to make sense of everything, trying to figure out what to do next. The city lights blurred past me, a kaleidoscope of neon and street lamps that seemed almost unreal, like I was trapped in some kind of distorted dream. I felt numb, disconnected from reality, as if I were watching my own life unravel from a distance. Eventually, I pulled into a deserted parking lot and killed the engine. The silence was deafening, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I sat there, staring out the windshield, my mind racing with thoughts of Becky, of Tony, of everything that had been torn apart in the span of a few hours. My life had been shattered, and I didn't know how to pick up the pieces. But one thing was clear. I couldn't just leave things as they were. I couldn't let Tony walk away with that smug grin, thinking he'd won, thinking he'd gotten the best of me. And I couldn't let Becky think that her betrayal would go without consequences. I needed a plan, a way to take back control, to make them both pay for what they had done. I leaned back in the driver's seat, closing my eyes, and let my thoughts spiral. I knew I had to be smart about this. I had to find a way to get to Tony, to make him regret ever crossing me. And Becky? I wasn't sure what I would do about Becky yet. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to try and work things out, but another part of me wanted to see her suffer, to feel the same pain I was feeling. After what felt like hours, a plan began to form in my mind. It was risky, but it was the only way I could see to get some semblance of justice, to find some way to make things right. I would confront Tony again, but this time on my terms. I would lure him into a situation where he couldn't talk his way out, where he couldn't hide behind Becky or that cocky grin. I would force him to face the consequences of his actions. The hidden camera. That was the key. I still had the footage from earlier, the recording of our confrontation in his apartment, Becky in a towel, Tony's mocking words. I could use that, leverage it against him, force him into a corner. I knew it wasn't exactly ethical, but ethics had gone out the window the moment I'd seen my wife standing in another man's doorway. I turned the key in the ignition, the car roaring to life, and I headed back into the city. It was late, but I knew exactly where Tony would be. I had been watching him for days, learning his habits, his routines. He was a creature of habit, predictable in the worst way. He'd be at his usual bar, drinking with his friends, basking in his own smugness. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the distance, keeping to the shadows. I could see the neon sign of the bar flickering in the distance, hear the low murmur of voices, the occasional burst of laughter. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and pushed through the door. The bar was dimly lit, the smell of stale beer and cigarettes heavy in the air. I spotted Tony almost immediately, sitting at the bar, a drink in hand, laughing with a couple of guys who looked just as arrogant as he did. He hadn't seen me yet, and I took a moment to compose myself, to gather my thoughts. I needed to play this right, to keep my cool. I walked up to the bar, standing just a few feet away from him, and waited for him to notice me. It didn't take long. His laughter faded when his eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I saw a flash of surprise, maybe even fear. But then he recovered, his grin returning, wider than ever. "Well, well," he drawled, setting down his drink. "Look who decided to join the party. Haven't had enough yet, Mark?" I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to punch that grin off his face. "I need to talk to you," I said, keeping my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh? What's there left to talk about? I think we covered everything earlier, didn't we?" His friends chuckled, clearly enjoying the show, but I ignored them. "This isn't a conversation for here," I said, keeping my gaze locked on his. "Let's go outside. Now." He looked at me for a moment, weighing his options, then shrugged. "All right, fine," he said, pushing his stool back. "Let's go." We stepped outside, the cold air hitting us like a slap in the face. The street was mostly empty, a few cars passing by, but otherwise, it was just the two of us. Tony turned to me, his grin still in place, though there was a hint of caution in his eyes now. "So, what's this all about?" he asked, crossing his arms. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "I've got footage," I said quietly. "Footage of you and Becky. From earlier today. The things you said. The things you did." His grin faltered for a second. "So what?" he scoffed, trying to sound nonchalant. "You think that scares me?" "No," I replied calmly. "But I think it might scare your wife, or your boss, or maybe even the police. Depends on who sees it first." His face tightened, his jaw clenching. "You're bluffing," he said, but I could see the doubt creeping in. I pulled out my phone and opened the video file, letting it play just loud enough for him to hear. His own voice echoed back, taunting, mocking. I watched his expression change from cocky to concerned in a matter of seconds. "Delete that," he demanded, stepping closer. "Not a chance," I said, slipping the phone back into my pocket. "Here's what you're going to do. You're going to leave Becky alone. No more calls, no more texts, no more contact of any kind. And you're going to apologize to me, right here, right now, for what you've done." He laughed, a hollow, humorless sound. "And if I don't?" "Then I send this video to everyone who matters," I replied, my voice cold. "And I'll make sure they know exactly what kind of man you are." He stared at me, his eyes narrowing, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure a way out. But he knew he was trapped. I had him, and he knew it. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with anger. "You win. I'll stay away from Becky." "And the apology?" I pressed. He swallowed hard, his pride clearly burning. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. "Louder," I insisted. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice louder, dripping with contempt. "Good," I said, satisfied. "Now remember what I said. Stay away from her, or this video goes public." He glared at me, his face red with humiliation, but he nodded. "You've made your point," he grumbled. "Now get the hell out of here." I turned and walked away, my heart still pounding, but I felt a small, bitter sense of satisfaction. I had taken back some control, had made him pay, even if just a little. But as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over, that there would be more fallout, more consequences. And I still had to decide what to do about Becky. I drove home slowly, my mind racing despite the small victory I had just achieved. I had made Tony apologize, forced him into a corner, but it felt hollow. It wasn't enough. I still felt the sting of betrayal, the raw ache in my chest that refused to go away. And Becky. I still didn't know what to do about Becky. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. I sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the front door, half expecting Becky to be standing there waiting for me. But there was no one. No light, no movement. Just an empty house that didn't feel like home anymore. I got out and walked up the steps, the weight of everything settling heavily on my shoulders. When I opened the door, the silence hit me like a punch. I stood there in the darkened hallway, my breath coming in shallow, quick bursts. I wanted to call out to her, but the words caught in my throat. I flicked on the light and saw her sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen, a tissue clutched in her hand. She looked up at me, her face filled with a mix of hope and dread. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Did you talk to him?" I nodded, closing the door behind me. Yeah, I talked to him. She let out a shaky breath. And? And he won't be bothering you anymore, I replied, my voice flat. But don't think for a second that this makes everything okay. She nodded, wiping her eyes, looking down at her hands. I know, she said quietly. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but thank you. I stayed where I was, leaning against the wall, unsure of what to say, what to feel. Part of me wanted to sit down next to her, to comfort her, to hold her like I used to, but another part of me, the bigger part, was still too angry, too hurt. You think an apology is going to fix this? I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. She shook her head quickly. No, I don't. I didn't want you to do anything you'd regret. I didn't want things to get worse. I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the quiet room. Worse? Becky, I don't think things could get much worse. She flinched but nodded, accepting the blow. You're right, she murmured. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mark. I pushed off the wall and took a step closer, my hands trembling with the effort to keep calm. Why? I demanded again, needing to hear it, needing to understand. Why him? Why not come to me, talk to me, tell me you were unhappy? Her eyes filled with tears again, and she looked up at me, her face a mask of pain. I was scared, she admitted. Scared that if I told you, you'd leave me. Scared that I'd already lost you. Lost me? I snapped. Becky, you lost me the moment you decided to cheat, the moment you stepped into his bed instead of talking to me. She started to cry again, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I know, she whispered. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. I know I've probably ruined everything. But I still love you, Mark. I swear I do. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it right, if you'll let me. I closed my eyes, her words washing over me, feeling like knives cutting into my skin. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that she still loved me, that we could somehow fix this mess, but I didn't know how. I didn't know if I could ever look at her the same way again. I need time, I said finally, my voice cracking. I don't know if I can forgive you, Becky. I don't know if I want to. She nodded, wiping her tears, her face pale and drawn. Take all the time you need, she whispered. I'll be here, waiting, hoping. I turned away, my hands shaking, and walked down the hall to the bedroom. I didn't want to see her face anymore, didn't want to feel the pull of sympathy mixed with anger. I needed to be alone. I needed space to think, to breathe. I closed the bedroom door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, my mind spinning, my heart aching. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of twisted game, and no matter what move I made, I was bound to lose. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, and thought about what to do next. I thought about everything I had seen, everything I had heard, and tried to make sense of it all. I felt like I was on the brink of something, some decision that would change everything, but I didn't know what that decision was. Then my phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I glanced at the screen. A message from an unknown number. Mark, this is Tony. We need to talk. I have something you need to know. It's about Becky. My heart skipped a beat, a cold knot forming in my stomach. What the hell could Tony possibly have to say now? What more could he have to reveal? I stared at the message, my mind racing. Should I meet him? Should I listen? Was this another trick? Another mind game? Or was there something more, something I didn't know yet? I typed out a reply, my fingers shaking. Where? A moment later, the response came. The bar, tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Don't be late. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. I didn't trust Tony, not for a second, but something in his message felt different, urgent. I had a feeling that whatever he had to say, it was going to change everything. I put the phone down and closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing heart. Tomorrow night, I would get the answers I needed, one way or another. I couldn't think straight as I drove back home. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The city streets blurred around me, neon lights streaking by like ghosts. Tony's words echoed in my mind, the messages from his phone flashing before my eyes. Did you really think she's only seeing you? Ask her about Daniel. She's playing you both. It felt like a sick joke, like the universe was laughing at me, piling betrayal on top of betrayal. First Tony, and now this. Was there really another man? Had Becky lied to me again, even after everything that had come out? I needed to know. I had to confront her face to face once and for all. I pulled up to the house and slammed the car door shut. My legs felt like lead as I walked up to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was dark, quiet, too quiet. "Becky?" I called out, my voice barely steady. "We need to talk." I waited, listening for any sign of her, but the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I noticed a faint light coming from the kitchen. I walked toward it, my footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. I pushed the door open and froze. Becky was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. Her hands were shaking, a nearly empty glass of wine in front of her. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of fear and something else. Guilt, maybe. "Mark," she started, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. "I just spoke to Tony," I said, my voice hard. "He told me about the texts, about Daniel. Is it true, Becky? Is there another man?" Her eyes widened, and I saw panic flash across her face. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "Mark, I don't know what he told you, but it's not what you think," she stammered. "Not what I think?" I barked, stepping closer, my anger boiling over. "He showed me the messages, Becky. He said there's someone else. Tell me the truth." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I didn't want you to find out like this," she whispered. I didn't know how to tell you." My blood ran cold. She wasn't denying it. She wasn't even trying to lie. "So it's true," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You've been cheating on me with someone else, even after everything." She looked up at me, her face wet with tears, her eyes pleading. "Mark, I'm sorry," she cried. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was so lost, so confused. And Daniel, he was just there. I don't love him. I never did. It was just a distraction." "A distraction?" I repeated, feeling like the ground was falling away beneath me. "A distraction from what? From us? From your marriage?" She nodded, her sobs growing louder. "I know I've ruined everything," she wailed. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, please, Mark, I was lost. I was so lost." My mind was reeling. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a pattern, a choice she had made over and over again. I felt my fists clench at my sides, my body trembling with a mixture of anger and despair. "How could you do this to me?" I shouted, my voice breaking. "How could you destroy everything we built?" She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I pulled away. "Don't!" I hissed. "Don't touch me. Don't say another word." Her face crumpled, and she collapsed into a heap of sobs, her shoulders shaking. I stood there, feeling a mix of hatred and sorrow, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I turned to leave, to get as far away from her as possible, when I heard it. A small, barely audible sound, a choked breath. I turned back, and Becky was clutching her chest, her face twisted in pain. "Mark, I don't feel—" she gasped, her voice weak. I stared at her, not understanding at first, but then I saw it. Her skin was pale, too pale, her breathing shallow, rapid. She was struggling, her eyes wide with fear. "Mark, help me," she whispered, before her body slumped forward. hitting the table with a dull thud. "Becky!" I shouted, rushing to her side. I grabbed her shoulders, shook her gently. "Becky, what's happening?" Her eyes fluttered, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She clutched at her chest, her lips turning a shade of blue. "I can't breathe," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "I need an ambulance," I shouted into the phone. "My wife! She's not breathing! Please, hurry!" The operator's voice was calm, professional, but I barely heard the words. I dropped the phone and turned back to Becky, trying to keep her conscious. "Stay with me, Becky," I pleaded, my anger forgotten, replaced by fear. "Please, stay with me." But her eyes were rolling back, her body going limp. I watched helplessly as she struggled for air, each breath more labored than the last. I could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but they seemed too far away, too slow. "Becky, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Don't leave me. Not like this." Her eyes flickered for a moment, and she seemed to look at me, really look at me, one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice so faint I could barely hear it. And then, just like that, her body went still, her chest no longer rising. "Becky!" I screamed, shaking her, trying to bring her back, but there was nothing, just the silence, the crushing, suffocating silence. The paramedics arrived minutes later, but it felt like hours. They pushed me aside, their voices urgent, but I knew it was too late. I watched as they tried to revive her, tried to bring her back, but there was no response. Finally, they stopped, their faces grim. One of them turned to me, his expression sympathetic. "I'm sorry, sir," he said softly. "She's gone." I felt my knees buckle, the world spinning around me. Becky was gone. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, she was gone, leaving behind only pain, only questions, only regrets. I fell to my knees, my hands shaking, tears streaming down my face. I had come here for answers, for closure, but now all I had was loss, a void that could never be filled. Becky was gone, and there was nothing I could do to change that. Nothing would ever be the same again.